Hello, I'm Greg, and I'm going to do a talk video and try to do them a bit more regular and not put a lot of effort into post-production. But the most important thing I'd like to talk about first is the Charlie Kirk assassination scenario, where for the longest time, the American people have not had a collective trauma since maybe 9/11. The attempt on Trump's life, the one that was the most known, the other guy tried to kill himself with a screwdriver in court, but the one that I'm talking about is the one with crooks and the grazing of the ear. And we don't necessarily know much more about that particular situation either, because these types of events are they're seemingly allowed to happen. So who allows them to happen is one question to have. I suppose you have to have a state okay it. And a lot of citizen journalism, journalists in their work, they refer to this as a state sponsorship. So how do you have a lack of security on rooftops when we've already had a bunch of rooftop activity in recent time? You'd expect there to be so in other words, it's allowed. So in other words, a man is martyred. In other words, it takes the shape of what did this really mean, and how do we obtain what this means? So what it means fundamentally is some group can come into our dimension, almost as it were, and take a man out. They can come in, they can make it look like a political hit job, but it's really more going on. It's really a select few people have to know about it. There's either advanced technology on the scene where people are referring, there's evidence to suggest that there is drones on site, and then it brings up the question of extrajudicial killings. So the idea is why would they have done this? What does it do really? So it upsets a whole lot of people. It causes people to have a lot of questions in an information vacuum. And it causes people to police, self-censor, edit the way that they're talking about something. But it also there's also a lot of people paid to say a specific thing online, where now how the powerful crimes of a country, even such as Israel, it's a catch-22 right now to kind of implicate them for a wide variety of reasons. Even though there's motive, means, and opportunity, the odd part of where we were in Utah, where this is a Mormon enclave, you have to go to specific areas of the country and specific places in order to practice a specific religion. So what I'm saying is, at what point is there an organized crime element? Often I should mention that gun violence just is not thought about properly. In the United States, the main takeaway for most people is that if we can control the guns, well, then we can control outcomes like this. They'll say mental health is a factor, and if we take a look at medications and things, that if we iron out behavioral problems, well, that's going to solve it. But what if there is a hand that guides these people? What does that look like? If you are a paramilitary-minded, disaffected youth, of which there are probably very many, what are the steps that it would take to groom that person into doing something or being part of something that they really don't understand, number one? Or to the extent that they do understand it, someone is able to do this on a routine basis, especially in the United States. We don't see too many Breiviks in other countries that are first either labeled maybe a decade ago, right-wing extremist behavior, and now we have left-wing extremist behavior. But these definitions really fail to do much about the problem itself, which starts to become clearer the more that one studies this type of thing. So what happens to someone, I think, is in order to dodge the apathetic pitfall of there's a lot of operations going on, let's just take it into account that while not everything starts off as an operation, a lot of these things can be hijacked and changed and manipulated. So it's not at all crazy because the moment that you understand that that's what's going on, a group can come in, either utilize a type of Patsy 2.0, groom that person, utilize that person, and conduct an operation. And if that operation is successful, what are our successful ones look like? Well, in this case, Charlie Kirk was indeed taken out. So that did occur. A man was martyred to cause a very huge information vacuum, where a lot of people are looking at this and scratching their heads and really thinking deeply and coming up with theories. And these theories bother people that are either propagandists, paid agitators, and so on. So in the landscape, we have paid agitators, and these people make a lot of money doing this. And there's also probably people paid to say things like, the man isn't dead after all, the man is still alive, he faked it. So once you understand that that's the battlefield, that's the landscape, now we can start to talk about what occurred, where we received initially very strange language on the part of Kash Patel to suggest that the investigation took 33 hours. You know, this is a symbolic number, but I'll leave that out there for people to hold, because there's a lot of symbolism in an operation. It's as if you have to announce in a coded way to someone, maybe the same group, that you're taking an approach that has an occult tinge to it. Is Kash Patel suggesting that? Is someone tell him to say that? You know, there's a lot of questions that really are swirling around this event, where the widow is is in a powerful position. She's somewhat she comes from an unusual past that I wonder what happened there, really. I mean, I've seen very little of their dynamic as husband and wife, but what I have seen is behavior that was quite robotic, and a performance. And it has to be a performance because these are people that have to have body doubles. You know, I can't imagine a life, and most people probably can't imagine a life very, very well at the, you know, I don't know how to say it other than at very, you know, you can't, you can't say you can't imagine it 100%, because you can. But actually a life lived is the thing that I'm talking about, where if you're a very young man and you get sucked up into a machine of an interesting corporate and religious convergent 501c3, where there's a lot of donations flying into this thing, and there's a lot of agendas, and there's a lot of moneyed interest. So you start to think, well, what must be like to be an actual popular musician that has things asked of them? You know, could you say, for example, in Michael Jackson, you know, you say things like, can you say derogatory language toward Israeli populations in one song on purpose? So can you cause this synthetic controversy? So what I'm saying is that there's no real, it doesn't seem like there's any limit to the amount of engineering and narrative making in events in the United States. Is we want to remember something fondly, you know, we want to remember something through rose-colored lenses, you know, but we may in fact need a reality dose of reality and the ability to actually test reality, which is somehow being eroded. And you could make an argument that the reality testing is impaired because of attention deficit, you know, and the lack of the brain's ability to form new memories in the process overnight because of sleep interruption and the variety of environmental insults and medicines in our in bodies. So the deck is stacked against people's ability to actually attest this reality, because the truth has a lot of unusual features that aren't accounted for yet properly by, I would say, the vast majority of people speaking. I mean, they can only fly at their altitude, per se. And there can be great things at each person's altitude. But it really comes down to a conscious awareness on what's actually happening. So you have to prepare yourself for potentials, prepare yourself mentally, and abide in the idea that plumbing the depths of a truth is super important today, because a lot of things that happen with presidents and high positions of high power, there's a huge revelation on this corruption element, where it does appear to me that those in the dark triad have an evolutionary advantage to achievement. But for how long, I wonder? Because in some sense, it does appear that an American president has to have compromat upon him. And then we can say this about Charlie Kirk, in that it's a lot of these origin stories are rather synthetic, where somehow you're boosted on a platform when you have negative engagement metrics. I suppose that if you put it to the grindstone and look at what he was doing, it's really kind of, it really does seem to come out of the circus. And I don't mean this in a derogatory way, really. I really don't. I mean this in that it's a setup where there's going to be a plant in the crowd. That person's going to come to the mic, and then they're going to have their ass handed to them. And that's what's going to happen. And that's going to happen. And then it got creepier with the influx of the OnlyFans thing, which I think is probably got a lot of CIA hands on it. But that being said, then there's an element of sex appeal, which also further drives that negative re-engagement metric algorithm, where I get upset if I'm on the left and I watch this, but I can't not watch this. But I'm going to watch this because this seems like what. Well, anyway, you're drawn to the conflict, maybe, seeing how someone gets owned. Well, anyway, what was wrong with that? Okay, so now he's doing that for years. He has a very successful business model. There is no voices on the right, really, that encompass anything like that yet. You know, I mean, you had Crowder, I guess, you had other people, but there's no one to fill this void now. So who would want that to end? You know, it's very similar to why movements end in this country. It seems like you know, if you end I don't know what's the best way to say it. So if you end a movement, you have a reason to end that movement. And what is that based upon? I do wonder, because, you know, it looked like Charlie Kirk was turning turning away from the Judeo element. He was turning away from the Ukraine element. And perhaps he had intention to run for president someday. So if he had all of those things, where does that leave his wife and his children? And how odd it does seem to be that when you're a celebrity, it's as though you don't really have a family. Your family is is vouchsafed often, until they're not, maybe. The main thing is, like, you know, when you have a patsy, where are their parents? You know, in this case, it's an older patsy. You know, if we take the recent idea that it was very clear that George Joannidis groomed Oswald for a while before the events took place, that, you know, you probably have to think of it like it serves a purpose that we cannot really fully get yet. You know, if they have a goal in mind that you need to stop, it does appear to be the case that that's what you would do. And that might be all there is to it. On the other hand, I think it coincides with there's some kind of secretive need for sacrifice. Now, where would that come from? I can think of a lot of reasons to well, let me say, so I suppose the bottom line is, when you see a deep event that has the hallmarks of that, meaning unusual information, very little information, conflicting information, in other words, contradictory information, where he has the gun when he's on the roof or not. He disassembles the gun or not. He runs in two different directions or not. Tyler Robinson reassembles the gun or not. Is this actually the gun being used? What was the bullet? How did the bullet travel? Do we deserve to know this? I think people deserve to know what took place that day. Because if we don't expose, if no one can get to the bottom of how the mass shooting phenomenon, if you can't figure out why this occurs, you can't solve the problem. So you can't solve a school shooting. You can't solve a high-profile murder if you can't figure out how they're doing it. And it's 2025, and I say that we deserve to know how these things are happening. So I'll leave that one there.